Cover your eyes and your ears and your nose. This game actually won't start until all orifices are covered. It was very experimental tech at the time, very controversial, but the developer really wanted to push the boundaries here with orifice covering technology. This was a game that the developer sent to me, and it's very reminiscent of Silent Hill, which is good because we haven't really gotten a good one of those in like over 10 years now. And I mean, the last good one we got was, one Konami doesn't want us to be able to actually enjoy or experience. And aside from that, all we've gotten are like NFT related things, slot machines, and a remake of an actual good game by Bloober Team. So I might be a little presumptuous in saying this, but this might be the best Silent Hill we've gotten in the past 10 years. I'm just gonna say that. It's not a perfect game. It does have some issues that I will be critiquing here and there, but it is a game that I sat down for one evening and played through in one sitting and enjoyed my time with. Like I said, not perfect. There are some issues I'll bring up, but I think a lot of issues can also be resolved just with more experience and putting more stuff out there, and I think the developers still made a pretty good game. One that I would say is worth playing, especially if you like horror games. The story follows Chloe, ex-cop, loving wife, mother of two. But things are never that simple, are they? At her job, you learn that Chloe has recently been passed over for promotion. We learn that this might be because of a physical altercation between her husband and one of her co-workers. We'll learn more about this later. But we also learn a lot about her past as an ex-cop, and that she was put on indefinite leave for excessive force during a standoff with a mass murderer. And because of this, her boss just doesn't feel comfortable around her enough to give her that promotion. On her way home, she goes to pick up her son Jake at school, and we learn that he's not terribly popular with his teachers. And neither is Chloe. However, she defends herself, her son, and her parenting style and takes her son home while giving him a present in the form of a BB gun and promises to teach him how to use it because good parenting means firearms. This will also lead to the tutorial of learning how to shoot, which using controller is a little rough, but I managed to make do. Once she gets home, she meets her neighbors, who she attempts to death stare into interaction, only to have them stare into her very soul and forces her to panic and flee in terror. Where then she goes home and meets her cute little daughter, who is the cutest thing ever and must be protected. Also, the greatest save cat ever, Buttons. We also get to meet Chloe's husband, who is currently between jobs, not terribly enthused about much, and when Chloe kind of confronts him about some things, we learn that when there was a physical altercation between him and her coworker, it was over some strange interaction about her coworker thinking they were in a relationship and getting weirdly violent and threatening about stuff. They decide to talk more about this later, as Chloe has to go teach her son how to shoot a gun, because good parenting! After the combat tutorial, however, Chloe finds her husband's phone. She notices some weird texts from a different woman talking about how they were going to get together behind Chloe's back. Later on that night, she proceeds to go and try and confront her husband and this woman that he's meeting. You'll note that the first thing she does is get her gun, which is actually kind of a nice little tip-off to her personality type right there. It's subtle, but it's nice. I like that. However, before she can go and confront her husband and this woman, a bunch of air raid sirens go off, and suddenly the world gets turned upside down. There are monsters running the streets, violence everywhere, and now she has new priorities. Priority 1, get her children to safety. Priority 2, find her husband and maybe shoot him a whole bunch. And priority 3, get out with her children. But things are never that simple. The story itself is actually quite good. It has lots of twists and turns and not necessarily things that you'd expect. I mean, I would say that there was one plot twist I kind of expected, and it only sort of happened. Maybe it's kind of ambiguous and up to your own interpretation, and that's quite cool. The story does go into some interesting dark places, and it kind of plays around with both psychology of the character as well as the situation itself and her core values. We get to see a lot about Chloe, which is fantastic. However, this does lead to one of like 3 issues I have with the story, and that is that this game kind of sort of pulls out a very, very powerful writing device and then proceeds to kind of do nothing with it. Without spoiling too much, the game plays around with the idea at one point that Chloe might be an unreliable narrator. We get to see the actual altercation that happened with her and the mass murderer in her past that caused her to lose her job, and you'll learn that she kind of left out one very important key detail that kind of changes the optics of the situation and who she is as a person. And when you witness that, you kind of think, okay, I see what's going on. She's not entirely playing us on the level here. She's lying to us, the player, like she lied to the boss at the start because we were working with the same information. And in turn, all the events we're witnessing might not be entirely as we're witnessing them. Because again, she might not be the reliable narrator we thought she was. But outside of the one moment where you see her past and it's kind of explained to you that that's kind of what's happened, with the exception of one thing at the end maybe that is left ambiguous and up to interpretation, I guess, the game plays Chloe entirely sincere to the player all the way through up to that point. And that's kind of weird because you've established her as this character with these strong moral values, and then you show us that, okay, she might not entirely be that person, except that she just goes on to be that person, you know? It's unfortunate because you pull out a very, very powerful narrative tool and then just kind of don't use it. And it left me a little bit disappointed, I'm not gonna lie. The second issue I noticed with this is a problem that I would say could only be fixed by adding more time and more resources to the project. With it being a one-person thing, I imagine that probably wasn't too viable, short of putting a lot more time into it. But there isn't a lot of interaction with anything in this game. I said this during the story, but, you know, at the start, you can go see Chloe's neighbors. They're standing outside their house, but there's no way to talk to them. There's no way to really go around and look at various bits of your environment and get Chloe's take on it or get some sort of analysis of what's going on. This could actually lead in quite well to building up flavor text around the world and even, once again, bringing out Chloe's mental state to see whether or not we could actually trust what she's saying, because she might be seeing something different than we see or what she's showing us. And by adding more flavor, you certainly add a lot more immersion to a game. And that's a huge deal. Frequently, there would be times where I'd like to talk to characters, maybe get them to tell me what they want me to do again because I forgot or something. And you just can't talk to any characters outside of scripted, effectively cutscene moments. Unless something is absolutely necessary to solving a puzzle or something, you can't really interact with anything in the environment, which is especially unfortunate because there are a lot of empty rooms in the game that otherwise could at least be filled with objects that contain flavor text, which would help immerse you a little bit better. The other key issue in terms of the story itself is the writing itself probably could have used a bit more of an editor. Like, I noticed two big things, and the first one is that the game seems to have a natural aversion to starting sentences using personal pronouns. So instead of saying, say, I will go to the store, or he will go to the store, the game would say, we'll go to the store, which isn't strictly wrong, and that can actually work in a sense. If you're writing around characters that are impersonal and want to give short, terse statements to try and limit their interactivity with other people, it kind of makes sense and it kind of works, but that's the tone and the manner of speech every character has in this game. And when every character does it, it just comes across that all the writing just feels a little bit stilted. In addition, I noticed that some of the tenses in certain situations were a little bit wrong. I noticed one in actually the final cutscene that was off that struck me as kind of a weird note to end the game on, just because it's like, oh, that's the final cutscene, and that's, again, not quite a spelling error or anything, but it just doesn't seem right and makes the writing seem a little bit stilted. And I think this problem in general could just be fixed with having an editor. But this is also an RPG Maker game made by one person, so I get resources were probably short. It's not incomprehensible or anything, but it is to the point that every time I read a line that was like that, I had to reread it 2 or 3 times just to make sure I was reading it right, because I noticed like my brain auto-corrected it, but it didn't match what I saw, so like I just had to make sure, you know? It just takes you out of the moment a little bit, but I've certainly played games with infinitely worse translations and infinitely worse writing. But the fact is that the core story is excellently told, and it's a very, very interesting story. It goes into some rather interesting places. And while I think it's unfortunate that they kind of didn't utilize their strongest tool that they brought out as well as they could have, and while I think they probably could have stood to have their writing edited a little bit, I think that the story is still very good by and large. The gameplay is a fairly well done survival horror. It's not without its flaws, but it worked relatively well and was overall very enjoyable. Now, it's worth noting that I played this on the Steam Deck with a controller, like I do pretty much all games I play on PC because it's most comfortable for me because my hands don't mouse and keyboard so well. And this is a game that is registered as unsupported and does not have controller support, but because this is an RPG Maker game, it has a rudimentary controller support, and it translates to the Steam Deck. There was a total of 2 issues I did have with playing with controller, though. While none of the buttons that are told to you in-game correspond to, a controller because they give you keyboard bindings as opposed to what's on the controller. Stuff like run is mapped to holding down the left stick. It makes sense. I did have one button that wasn't mapped to the controller at all, and I didn't have options to add it or remap it or anything. And that was pause. And that's kind of an important button. In fact, my controller start button had the boot the player to the main menu function mapped to it for reasons I don't really understand. And on a hierarchy of button function, that's one I wouldn't even list. I lost some time to accidentally pressing the start button, hoping to pause and booting myself to the menu. That happened a few times. There is one issue that was a quite severe one, at least to begin with using a controller, and that is because aiming with the firearms is mapped to the mouse. While your controller can sort of simulate that with the right stick, it is very, very, very sensitive. If the game had actually executed its aiming the way it seemed like it was trying to, that would be a problem, but it doesn't quite. The game sort of portrays its aiming as, hover your mouse over what you want to shoot and then shoot. But in practice, that's not actually how it seems to work. Relative to your character, where your mouse cursor is located in the basic 4 cardinal directions, your character will turn and then shoot in that direction. And if an enemy's lined up with you on the same row of tiles, you'll shoot and hit them. That's basically it. So while controlling a mouse cursor using the right stick was really awkward, as long as you could kind of waggle it into the vague general cardinal direction that you need to, it works perfectly fine. And while target practice at the start was very, very awkward, the moment I realized that, it became infinitely more playable, and there wasn't really any control issues at all at that point. Now, the core gameplay loop is relatively simple. It takes place in 2 phases. Phase 1 is more of a transitory phase. You start in a safe location, usually with your kids, keeping them safe, but you have to leave that safety and venture out into the darkness and the unknown in order to move forward with the plot. This means that you eventually end up on the streets with several open buildings, which you can fully explore, and you will want to do this because that allows you to search for ammunition and healing items, which you're going to want to stock up on as much as possible because this is survival horror. And by the end, I pretty much used everything I scrounged up, and I was searching everywhere. I was very thankful I did that. Once you actually pass this transitory phase and actually get to your destination, then it enters the dungeon phase. And these dungeons are fairly simple. You wander around these dark, dilapidated environments, searching for usually several items or several buttons to solve rather simple puzzles across the building to open up one key door to allow you to advance the plot. It is then that you move on to the next aspect, which is another transitory chapter, rinse and repeat. This is a bit of an issue with the gameplay loop. It does feel a little bit samey when you break it down like that, especially when you see the game is willing to take risks and experiment with changing up the formula a little bit here and there. At one point, there's a dungeon where you control 2 characters asynchronously that have slightly different movesets, and that was interesting. At another point, you run into a sort of boss fight that completely strips you of your ability to fight, and you have to fight in a very unorthodox manner. And that was a very interesting way to have sort of shaped a chapter. While the game is willing to experiment with these gameplay changes and these different ways of structuring the dungeon chapters, it seems to fall back frequently into a comfortable niche of just rinse and repeat of go through every door and collect X number of items or hit X number of switches to open one door that was blocking you at the start so you can move on. And it's kind of a shame to see that it does explore those territories and then kind of just ignores it for the most part. It's not a game killer by any means, but it's just sad to see that it is willing to explore more adventurous territories with how it wants to express itself, but it also wants to rely a lot on a standard formula for each of its dungeons. The enemies themselves are very varied by design, however, functionally, there's only about 3 different types. You get standard enemies that just sort of wander around sort of aimlessly until they see you, and then they'll charge straight at you. If they get to an adjacent tile to you, they will unleash a melee attack which will hit you. You will run into enemies that have a ranged attack. These guys especially I prioritize taking out because they are obnoxious to deal with if you leave them alone. And then there are enemies that'll just run full tilt at you. These guys are particularly terrifying because they are fast. And if you ever hear a baby gurgling at you, get ready because they're coming at you and it's going to be real scary. Those little tiny enemies, which are some of the first enemies you run into, are absolutely frightening. The AI itself seems to be a little bit random in terms of how it functions. It seems to start out in sort of an idle state where they'll wander around, but once they detect you, they will head straight at you, usually prioritizing you above everything else. However, one thing that actually seemed pretty clever to me, and this might have just been another instance of the AI just being sort of weird and random, but I noticed frequently when I started actually damaging enemies, they would actually back off and sort of run away and sort of swap into a like semi-random state where they were trying to keep their distance. And maybe this is me misattributing a sense of self-preservation to just, again, the AI being random, but it was refreshing to see the AI going out of their way to try and keep themselves alive. But the fact is, once you start damaging enemies, you have to be committed to that because every bullet is a valuable resource. And once you leave an area, any enemy that survived your attacks, no matter how much health they may have, will fully recover. But if they're dead, they're gone forever. So if you see an annoying enemy and you have to commit yourself to starting a fight, you have to chase them down and be committed to it. And that made combat a very interesting proposition. Typically, I was actively trying to avoid fighting as much as possible to keep my ammo as stocked up as possible, and it's very important you do so. But at the same time, when I ran into a ranged enemy or an enemy that charged you really fast, I had to go out of my way to try and make sure they were done by the end of the day because I was already committed to this fight. And I couldn't just leave that alone, because if I did, when I came back, I'd have to deal with it all over again and waste potentially even more resources. The resource management in terms of combat is an excellent risk-reward system where you have to balance out whether or not it's important to get rid of an enemy or keep the resources, and I appreciated every fight making me make that meaningful call. The individual weapons themselves are not terribly spectacular. There's about a dozen or so different guns. Unfortunately, most of them feel very identical, with the differences being more damage. There were a total of 3 that behaved slightly differently, 2 with like a stunning effect, and 1 that was like a full auto. It was nice to see different weapons that behaved differently. It's just kind of a shame that the others didn't have that effect as well, because that would open up different combat strategies and different ways you might want to consider managing your resources in order to take out your opponents and later survive. Because this game is very much about survival. Enemies are everywhere. Even in empty rooms, you might find one enemy that'll chase you down if you take one wrong turn. And it's important to keep resources and avoid spending them when you don't need to. Now that said, I think this game, in terms of gameplay, does have one rather large issue structurally, and that is that it is somewhat lopsided. The first 80% of the game is steeped in playing it stealthy, collecting resources, fighting to stay alive at every turn, and trying to avoid combat as much as possible while solving puzzles. But the last 20% of the game is like combat, 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 game's over. It just felt a little off, you know? I feel like this was done as a sort of clumsy way to create a climax in the game towards the end, but it kind of trivialized the entire setup of the game up front as a atmospheric horror game where you were focusing more on struggling to survive and avoiding fighting, just for the sake of making it a little bit more exciting at the end. And I feel like that sort of trivialized the horror aspect and the meaning of each and every encounter at that point, because they were all disposable mooks that I had to mow down with an AK-47. It was very strange. The game also offers you a melee option in case you run out of ammo, and melee in this game is incredibly awkward and really not terribly fun. Again, this might be because the game was designed primarily with a mouse for aiming and I was using a controller, but I will say that I did not enjoy using the melee at all, and unfortunately, the game actually forces you to, like, twice. On the bright side, this is actually pretty powerful thematically, and it kind of excuses the awkwardness, but it does not change the fact that it's not super pleasant, and the fact that the game forces you to twice is definitely a low point, I think. Other than that, the game is pretty well made, though. I've Didn't really find any glitches. At 2 points, I noticed that 2 specific wall tiles didn't have collision. At one point, I walked one tile into a wall, and at one point I saw an enemy do the same in different buildings. There are just a couple small things, though. Again, the lack of interaction is something of a big one that would allow the game to have a lot more flavor text and a lot better insight into who Chloe is and who these other characters are around based on their interactions that are just not there. When you're not in a building, you can frequently see edges of maps, and while you can make the argument that it does make sense thematically, it does feel a little bit sloppy. It's immediately immersion breaking. I'm no longer Chloe wandering around this destroyed city trying to save my kids and trying to find a way out. I'm suddenly a character walking around on a map and there's the edge, you know? But that said, the misplacing of collision in 1 or 2 tiles, the fact that you can see the edges of maps, the fact that there's not as much interactivity as there possibly could be, even just awkward pacing, these are all things that I think that can be fixed with more experience. I took a look on the Steam page, and at least on Steam, this is the developer's first game, and I think that's a very strong first attempt. Now, maybe they made a lot of other games that just haven't made it onto Steam, I'm not sure, but I can say this, that this is definitely a sign that this developer knows how to make something good. I think the developer needs to refine their talents a little bit more and experiment a little bit more, figure out what works, figure out what doesn't. It's all a matter of experience. You learn to cover up the seams of your map so that you can't see the edges so it doesn't completely break your immersion. You learn to double, triple check that stuff has collision where necessary. It's basic stuff that with more experience, with more time, etc., you know, it can be refined, and I think just with the quality we have here, the developer did an amazing job, and I'd love to see more from them. And I'd love to see them hone their craft and further sharpen their skills, because what they have here is very well done. Not perfect, certainly rough around the edges, but I can easily see these things being improved upon moving forward. And what we have is very, very good. The overall presentation is very well done. First of all, and I cannot stress this enough, no default tiles, which automatically makes this one of the better RPG Maker games out there, just by virtue that it actually is memorable to look at, unlike every other RPG project out there. So thumbs up for that. There's lots of great little details in the environments, and there is a wide variety of enemies. Although I think the enemies are somewhat of a mixed bag. One of the earliest enemies you run into are like these sort of generic zombies, which are just people with heads that spin around, and they look a little bit goofy. But there are some really creepy enemies in here as well. I particularly like the pursuer character in this game. There's like this demonic knight guy that'll follow you around once or twice. Unfortunately, he's massively underutilized, especially as a sort of constant threat pursuer type character, but he's an awesome character, and when he shows up, he absolutely steals the show in terms of how memorable he is. He's a great designed character. Also, small detail, but every weapon looks unique, and they actually get held on your character model in a unique way each, which, such a small detail, but very, very, very cool. And there's even some great cutscenes with close-ups of characters with lots of detail that are really well done. I am thoroughly impressed with the visuals. The only other thing offhand I can think visually that might be a bit of an issue is some of the ammo when it's lying on the map. It's a little hard to tell what specific ammo it is because there are a bunch of them and a few of them look somewhat similar. But that's a very, very small thing, and you know, when you pick it up it tells you exactly what kind it is anyway, so it's not that big a deal. And the audio design is excellent. The music, for the most part, is just oppressive and is constantly drowning you in atmosphere, creating such a fantastically bleak and scary tone. I love the music in this. And when it's not doing that, it is some like incredible industrial rock nonsense. At one point you have to go to a nightclub, and I just had to stand there for a minute and just rock out to the music because, and I said this out loud while I was playing, that is a song that's straight out of Vector Man. It was just so rockin'. The sound effects are okay. Like I said, when you hear a baby gurgle with those little tiny fast guys, you know to panic and be on your guard for sure, for sure. The shotgun had a particularly crunchy sound applied to it that made it an absolute treat to use. Unfortunately, all the other guns sound very, very weak by comparison, and given how audibly enjoyable it was to use the shotgun, I didn't want to use the other guns, even though almost all of them are better. Kind of a shame, but the audio design for the shotgun is great. And overall, the presentation, it is very, very well done. Now, do I recommend for the $5 or so it costs? Yeah, Yeah, I think I do. I said this at the start, but this is probably the best Silent Hill game I have played in the past 10 years. And to be fair, Silent Hill is owned by Konami. What have they put out in the series? A demo to a game that people loved, but they made sure no one could ever actually play and desperately tried to make people forget it ever exists, and upcoming a remake of a good game by Bluebird Team. Do we need a remake to Silent Hill 2? We already have a perfectly good Silent Hill 2. It's called Silent Hill 2. It's been on my shelf for like 15 years now. We don't need a new AAA version of it that's probably going to be broken on launch for a $100 plus starter fee, probably filled with microtransactions, NFTs, loot boxes, things that are designed to actively target the neurodivergent. Basically what I'm saying is that Konami is one of the worst Japanese developers this side of Square Enix. The fact is, Konami only slings nostalgia with no actual respect for it, and they should probably just go away forever and do what they want by just making slot machines forever. They seem comfortable doing it, and they should keep that stuff as far away from things people could actually enjoy and have fun with. While they're at it, Silent Hill itself should probably actually die and just let fans, people who are actually passionate, understanding, and knowledgeable about the subject, take a swing at it, or at the very least make things analogous to it, not unlike this. Sure, the fans who want to make something analogous will have smaller budgets, smaller teams, less resources, a lot less experience, but they'll have passion, they'll actually care about the subject material, and they'll be willing to actually put their heart into something of value as opposed to just glorified gambling that's there to, again, target the neurodivergent, and just in general destroy a medium that I love more than most things in this world. And those resulting games probably won't have a $100 starters fee, barely work, probably be filled with microtransactions, loot boxes, and now NFTs. And I think that's a better world to live in. Well, that and if AAA development just went away forever, period. And the alternative to this is wildly more expensive, and I might be jumping the gun by saying this, but probably less functional and good in pretty much all respects because that's where AAA gaming is right now. The fact is, Cover Your Eyes might only be a one-person $5 indie RPG Maker game, but it gave me an entire night of enjoyment, which is more than most AAA games have done for a very long time, and it was a hell of a lot more functional. And it was just good. The fact is that this game is rough around the edges, but I think that the developer has a lot of promise, and I'd love to see them continue to hone their craft, and I think that for the low cost of $5, you can have a pretty solid evening with Cover Your Eyes, and your ears, and your nose, and your butt. Just make sure all your orifices are covered, is all I'm saying. And shoutouts to Buttons, the best save cat ever.